Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and I just want to say a few words about a subject that we have covered many times before on The Gaggle, and that is the upcoming NATO summit that will take place in Washington, D.C. Sometime in July. And as we have pointed out many times, this will be NATO's 75th birthday party, so it's a special event. If you recall, at NATO's 50th birthday party in 1999, NATO gave itself this glorious present of three new NATO member states: Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic were inducted into NATO. And of course, this was an opportunity for a lot of self-congratulation, because these three states had been members of the Warsaw Pact, and now they'd been co-opted into NATO. And then, of course, there were many expansions of NATO over the years, including the very big one in 2004. And given that this is what NATO likes to do when he has these birthday bashes, it stands to reason that at this 75th birthday party, it's going to want to do something special. It's going to want to give itself a very special present. And I've always thought that the present is going to give itself, it will be the induction of Ukraine into NATO. Now, obviously, it's a high-risk strategy, and there are all sorts of repercussions that will follow from such a decision. Nonetheless, it's something very substantial, and it's unlikely that NATO will be able to get away with another fudge on Ukraine as it did last year at the Vilnius summit. And confirming my suspicion that this is what NATO wants to do is an article that has just appeared in the illustrious Foreign Policy magazine. And it says that clearly there are loud and repeated voices within NATO demanding the accession of Ukraine. And then at the same time, there are dissident voices that are urging caution, restraint, and so on. The problem is that these voices that urge caution and restraint have been urging caution and restraint throughout this war in Ukraine. And lo and behold, those things that were supposed to be restrained were not restrained. And the notion that somehow you can hold things back by, hemming and hawing and so on, no, that doesn't really happen. So let's just take a look at this article in Foreign Policy magazine. And here, let me just pull this up. And this is the headline: US and Germany push to delay Ukraine NATO membership invite. Now, as we know, the US has made it a specialty over the years of pretending to be reluctant to do something that it actually wants to do. That it's, the US runs the whole Western NATO show, but it doesn't want to be seen to be running it. So it has to show that it's being pushed against his will, against his better judgment. It's being pushed into doing something that it's actually quite reluctant to do. Germany does the same thing, and largely for the same motives. I mean, with Germany, there are obviously a lot of anxieties about any kind of an assertive role by the Germans. And so therefore the Germans like to say, well, we don't really want to do it. We have our particular, responsibilities, we have a burden of history, and, We don't want to do this. But we know that that really doesn't cut much ice, because eventually the Germans do it. So whatever it is, you know, when to send something or other, to send some tanks. No, we don't want to send any tanks. Oh, all right, if you insist, we'll send some tanks. Taurus missiles. No, we're not going to send Taurus missiles. Oh, all right, if you insist, we'll send the Taurus missiles. Fighter aircraft. No, definitely. We're drawing a line on fighter aircraft. All right, well, if you insist, we'll send the fighter aircraft. It's a pattern. And here says, Ukraine and its Eastern European allies want the invite to come soon, but Washington and Berlin are wary. They're always wary. Every single thing that the United States sends, it only sends after there's a long, protracted debate and a lot of agonizing, apparent agonizing on the part of the administration, until finally they agree to send what they always wanted to send. And so it says, Ukraine and its strongest supporters are pushing NATO to formally invite Kiev to become a member of the military alliance during a major upcoming summit, but their efforts are facing significant behind-the-scenes pushback from the United States and Germany, according to a dozen current and former officials familiar with the matter. Always remember, if the United States really doesn't want something to happen, it won't happen. The United States totally dominates NATO. So to say that, oh, well, there is this behind-the-scenes pushback. No, if the Americans want to say no, they'll say no. They always have. We know that when they don't want something to happen, it doesn't happen. Kiev has backing from Eastern European countries already in the military alliance, including Poland and the Baltic states, which view extending NATO membership to Ukraine as the most effective and least costly way to blunt Russia's irredentist ambitions in Eastern Europe. All right, well, we'll drop the whole irredentist aspect to it. That's just foreign policy's spin. Keep in mind, Poland and the Baltic states have an interest, weird, though it undoubtedly is, have an interest in instigating a war between NATO and Russia. So when they push for an expansion of NATO, and particularly when they push for the induction of Ukraine into NATO, they are doing it with a view to provoking a war. Then they're not doing it in order to stop war. I mean, if you want to stop war, then you basically don't bring Ukraine into NATO. You only bring Ukraine into NATO if you want war. Yet other Western NATO officials, most notably in Washington and Berlin, believe that it's too soon to kickstart the process of admitting Ukraine to NATO while the country is still fighting a war against Russia. So it's too soon. But they're always happy to have a conversation. The fierce debate that is playing out behind the scenes in Washington and Brussels is existential for Ukraine and will determine the future of Europe's security landscape as NATO continues to adjust to the reality of Russian President Vladimir Putin's territorial ambitions. Again, that's their spin. We haven't seen any of these territorial ambitions, so but they want to present it as that way. A Ukraine in NATO could deal a death blow to Putin's neo-imperialist ambitions to annex Ukraine and possibly even further encroach on European territory. So again, foreign policy writing this absolute fact-free nonsense, neo-imperialist ambitions. If Putin had neo-imperialist ambitions, why didn't he take Ukraine in 2014? Why did he insist on the Minsk process? Why not just take the eastern provinces of Ukraine when they held a referendum in 2014? So this never made any sense. And then it says only Ukraine's NATO membership will finally convince Russia to pump the brakes on its invasion and end the war. So this is the view of these extremists who really don't want the war to end. I mean, they want this war, and they know, well, what will guarantee war? Well, if you bring Ukraine into NATO, that guarantees a war. I mean, the idea that if you bring it in to NATO, that's going to stop Russia is a an absurd hypothesis. But that's the way they can get this in there, and let's fool the rest of NATO into accepting in this. Hey, well, this will stop Russia, even though this war has only happened precisely because of the insistence, the Biden administration's clear insistence of bringing Ukraine into NATO. And then it says, among the most vocal backers of Rush ordering Ukraine's NATO membership invitation is Anders Fogh Rasmussen. We've covered him a few times here at the Gaggle. He's that guy who's now former NATO Secretary General and now serves as a lobbyist for Ukraine. He's a paid lobbyist for Ukraine, spends a lot of time in Washington trying to persuade reluctant Republicans to get on board for this the Ukraine gravy train. And it says, very often I hear the argument that we cannot invite Ukraine to join NATO as long as the war is going on. I think that's an extremely dangerous argument to use because that de facto provides Putin with a veto over NATO and gives him an incentive to continue hostilities in Ukraine indefinitely. Well, any country has a right to have a veto on a hostile military alliance on its borders. So the idea that, oh, this is terrible, he's presenting a veto over Ukraine. Yeah, it's a veto on a hostile military armed with missiles and everything else right on our borders. So the whole idea that this is some terrible thing, it's a veto or like a racist club that says, well, we can't possibly have this person as a member. There's something unacceptable about him. So it says, well, presenting a veto over NATO. Yeah, I mean, it's NATO that has posed such a threat to Russia that Putin has to say, yeah, we're going to have a veto, just as the United States would definitely have a veto should Mexico decide that they want to forge a military alliance with Russia. I mean, it's even pointless arguing about this. What do we think Washington will do in the event of Mexico's deciding that they want to station Russian forces in their country? Russians will be allowed to build military bases in Mexico, station missiles in Mexico. I mean, we know exactly. The United States would invade Mexico immediately, seize the president, take him to the United States and put him in prison. And the media would be cheering this on. NATO would be cheering this on. And they say, well, why did you do this? Well, because we have a veto on hostile military forces on our borders. Other proponents of this view believe that bringing Ukraine into NATO sooner rather than later will be cheaper in the long run than the current Western strategy of funneling arms and munitions to Ukraine in perpetuity while keeping NATO membership on the back burner. Ukraine can only hold a Russian invasion once it is brought into the alliance's fold, they argue. So what they're basically saying is that once it's in NATO, then essentially Ukraine has a NATO guarantee, and that NATO is then ready to go to war on Ukraine's behalf. And then they think, well, maybe it'll act as a deterrence to the Russians, maybe it won't, but at least we'll be able to sort this out now rather than letting this drag on. So they just want a war between NATO and Russia as soon as possible. Letting Ukraine into NATO too soon, however, particularly as large swathes of its territory are still occupied by Russian forces, could trigger a full-scale NATO-Russian conflict, given the 31-member alliance's bedrock collective defense clause that calls for all NATO countries to defend any country that has been attacked. Well, yeah. We've talked about Article 5 and so on, but all right, fine, let them go with it. Since they are basically intent on triggering a war, they might as well go with that interpretation of Article 5. Then there is the upcoming US presidential election, where incumbent President Joe Biden looks slated to face off against former President Trump. Trump, long a critic of NATO, hasn't said much on the campaign trail about Ukraine's NATO membership, but many officials and experts believe he wouldn't work to admit Ukraine into the alliance if he were elected, pushing Ukraine's hope for joining back at least 4 years. So in other words, the only thing that matters here are the wishes of Ukraine, not the wishes of American voters. So they're saying, well, okay, well, it may be Trump will win this election. In other words, he's going to express the aspirations of Americans who say, we don't actually want to go to war for Ukraine, which is what Trump is effectively saying. But I say, well, that means we're just going to have to delay this for 4 years. So in 4 years' time, we'll be able to get Ukraine in, and the hell with what American voters think. And let's remember, it's going to be Americans who are going to be on the line, because America is the only serious fighting force in NATO. So it's Americans who are going to be ready to, could well be committing national suicide on behalf of Ukraine. As the Biden administration begins crafting the agenda for a pivotal July summit in Washington, where it will host the leaders of all 31 NATO members, the issue is exacerbating tensions between the pro-membership camp, represented by Poland and the Baltic states, and the wait-and-see camp led by Washington and Berlin. France, which is mulling its own package of security guarantees for Ukraine separate from NATO membership, is seen as open to putting forward a formal invitation for Kiev to become a NATO ally. So France is going to go along with this Poland and the Baltic states, but France happily, it's a long way from anything. It's still going to be the United States that's on the hook. In a meeting at the State Department earlier this month between US diplomats and European parliamentarians pushing for a Ukrainian invite to NATO, the US diplomats urged the Europeans not to try to make Ukraine's NATO membership an agenda item at the upcoming summit, fearing that it would bring these internal divisions into the limelight and potentially give Russia grounds to escalate its military assault in Ukraine in the short term. Notice what they're doing here. They're not saying America is actually opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. What they are concerned about is that once you let the cat out of the bag and suggest that an invitation will be extended in Washington in July, then Russia will say, we better get this war wrapped up as quickly as possible, and destroy whatever we need to destroy before July. So I say the more you keep pressing, this is still January, so we're still 6 months away from this summit. The more likely is it that Russia will just want to end this war as quickly as possible. And of course, from Russia's perspective, I think that's absolutely the most sensible thing to do, because I think NATO is crazy enough to do it. So I think Russia needs, Russia has a limited window now and needs to act before this summit. Even if it doesn't happen, even if for some reason they decide not to invite Ukraine into NATO, that issue is going to come up next year. So it's Russia's window is quite narrow. But the European lawmakers who come from several countries, it says here, Great Britain, the Czech Republic, Lithuania pushed back. Notice Great Britain's in there. Pushed back, arguing that the best way for the United States to show leadership was to lead on membership. So they're pushing the United States to go ahead. So this, um, so, my apologies. Let me go back to this document. So, right. So this is the thing where we were. My apologies, a technical problem here. All right. Let's go back again. All right, let's see. All right, this is where we were. Yeah, apologies for the slight technical issue. And then we go. France is mulling it, and then we have the UK was involved, and then all of this echoes Biden's controversial decision to push off Ukraine's NATO membership bid at a major alliance summit last year in Vilnius. So this is they want to avoid the embarrassment of last year's summit. Just 2 days before that summit, Biden publicly axed the idea of inviting Ukraine to join NATO. They're calling the move premature and insisting that Kiev was not ready to join, angering Ukrainian and Eastern European officials. In response, President Zelensky slammed the alliance's indecision on a timeline for his country's NATO membership as unprecedented and absurd. And again, there was a lot of gleeful rejoicing after that summit, thinking, well, that's it. It's not going to happen. They're not going to, Ukraine isn't going to join NATO. They're going to keep it out. Big failure for the NATO-Ukraine camp. And it was obvious to me at the time that it's going to happen. I mean, they're going to press for this issue. Now, maybe it's going to fail again in July. That's a possibility. But there's no question it's going to keep coming up. That's the way the United States operates, the way NATO operates. They're going to just keep bringing this issue up again and again. So yeah, it didn't work in Vilnius, but now this is a much bigger opportunity, 75th birthday party, and it's in DC. And so this year, some NATO allies are advancing plans for interim security guarantees for Ukraine that would come short of alliance membership. The United Kingdom signed a deal earlier this month with Ukraine, and we talked about that. These agreements are modeled after US relations with Israel, in which Israel gets streamlined priority in arms deals and advanced military technology. And then other NATO allies, including Poland and France, are expected to follow suit. And then, of course, the obvious point arises that Israel is stronger than its enemies, and the United States can go on providing all kinds of assistance to Israel in the confident expectation that Israel will be able to deal with its enemies simply using this equipment, and the United States is not going to have to go to war on Israel's behalf. Now, that has been the formula so far with Ukraine. They've been giving Ukraine all sorts of equipment and training and money and so on. But Ukraine cannot win just with that alone. I mean, they cannot do it. I mean, it's up against a much stronger force. So therefore, there's only two options. You can either just give up, or there's going to come a point at which you're going to have to do the fighting on Ukraine's behalf, and there are plenty of voices within NATO, in Washington, and within the whole foreign policy bubble that want this to happen. They've been itching for this war with Russia for a long time. But those interim security guarantees are viewed as Kiev as a consolation prize, of course, to the real goal of NATO membership. Even if Ukraine received a formal invitation to join NATO, there's an open debate on when or how it could actually join if part of its territory was still occupied by Russia. So now this is the point where Rasmussen and the rest, they say, well, that's neither here nor there. Then, it doesn't matter that the territory is occupied by Russia. The important thing is if we get the bulk of Ukraine in, then we can use NATO to try to drive the Russians out. So they're just basically saying that, forget all this business occupying. We can use that as a way of driving the Russians out. There's a loose precedent for this in NATO history. West Germany entered the alliance while it was still divided during the Cold War, with East Germany serving as the Soviet Union's buffer against NATO on the other side of the Iron Curtain. But of course, as we've pointed out before, the whole point was that, that was indeed the case from 1949 through to 1970, but West Germany had no military plans to liberate East Germany. NATO had no military plans to liberate East Germany. How do we know that? Well, we know that from the Berlin crisis in 1953. Remember, in East Berlin, June 17th, 1953, there was a workers' uprising. It looked like the communists were in trouble, and then this was the moment. I mean, if NATO or West Germany were going to do anything about the communists in East Germany, that was the moment to intervene on behalf of the workers who rose up against the communist rulers. They didn't do it. In other words, and allowed essentially the Soviets to step in and crush this an anti-communist uprising in East Berlin. And that made it clear that West Germany had no plans to, quote, liberate, unquote, East Germany. What happened in 1970 with the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt is that this arrangement was formalized. I mean, effectively, West Germany and East Germany recognized one another as separate states. I mean, effectively, it was a de facto, it wasn't de jure, but it was de facto. In other words, they then held summits, the West German, East German summits, and they basically were two separate entities, and that therefore any attempt to remove the Soviet presence from East Germany was null and void. I mean, it was just it could not happen. That's very different from what NATO is planning now, what Anders Fogh Rasmussen and the rest of them saying. No, they want to drive Russia out of Ukraine. So this has a much more aggressive intent than was the case at any time during the Cold War in Germany. Yet this analogy falls flat for one obvious reason. Unlike Ukraine and Russia today, West and East Germany weren't in the midst of a full-scale war. Yeah, that's right. And it was they made sure of that West Germany at no point made any kinds of claims on East Germany, even though, of course, West Germany claimed to be speaking on behalf of the whole of Germany. Yeah, they can say, anyone can say anything that they like. But de facto, West Germany accepted the reality of an independent East Germany. Then there's the question of how long it would take Ukraine to join, even if it got the coveted formal invitation. NATO members have to unanimously approve admitting new members. Finland and Sweden, blah, blah. Finland has been admitted. Sweden is still in limbo. And then Orban is the holdout of, getting 31, and likely soon 32 member states to agree to admitting Ukraine is likely to be exponentially more difficult and could take years. Slovakia's populist and pro-Russian Prime Minister Robert Fico has said he would veto Ukraine's NATO membership because admitting Ukraine to NATO would mean nothing other than a basis for World War III. But of course, this is very interesting because Slovakia is a very small country, it has a population of 4 million. Ultimately, Slovakia doesn't call the shots in NATO. There are all sorts of means of bringing Slovakia to heel. I mean, we've seen how they're applying pressure against Hungary. Hungary is a bigger country than Slovakia, and Orban has a certain international reputation. But even so, they're applying a lot of pressure against Orban. And chances are NATO and the EU will prevail against Orban. They, if they can do that to Orban, they can definitely do that to Fico. So therefore, that's not going to hold anything up. The issue of unanimity. You apply a great deal of pressure, as they applied, with Erdogan, bribe, pressure, but in the end, Erdogan falls into line. Some experts believe that if the United States takes a strong stand on advancing Ukraine's NATO membership, at least most of the rest of the alliance currently waffling on the issue will follow suit. No question, no question. So that's the this article. I thought I would show you the argument. This is Foreign Policy Magazine, that's quite well connected with foreign policy making circles, and I think one should have a reasonable expectation that this is being talked about, this is being thought about, and could very well happen. We know that Biden and the people around Biden are absolutely reckless in their decision making. When we've seen that in the way they got involved in Ukraine, we've seen that in Gaza, we've seen that in their attack on the Houthis. They're getting themselves into a confrontation with Iran, and these are not people who think things through, who try to act in a way that advances the interests of real life Americans, real life Europeans. They're driven by kind of warmed over kind of geopolitics and a kind of fanatical hatred for Russia, or even some belief in America's divine mission in the world. Whatever goes on in their minds, they're not going to be stopped. These prudential assertions that you see in articles like this, well, maybe it's not such a great idea, maybe you should think about this, that's not going to prevail. So while that's not a done deal, Ukraine's induction into NATO is definitely not a done deal yet. It's something that we should begin to prepare for, and above all, it's something that Russia should prepare for and think about very, very seriously. 6-month window. Anyway, that's my thoughts for the day. Remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.